The original Subnautica is a game I played and reviewed back in 2019 that I absolutely adored. It played to my nostalgia of exploring the planets of the Metroid Prime trilogy. It's an absolutely marvelous 3D Metroidvania exploration game, and I can't recommend it enough, if you can get past the thalassophobia, which is the fear of the ocean. If you're coming into this critique wanting to get a picture of the general play style of the series, I'd heavily advise checking out my critique of the original game. This video will only be focusing on major and minor changes made in the sequel Below Zero, and some changes made from the early access to final release. I'll also be reiterating a handful of points made during my brief coverage of the early access version from the original video. I put the link in the description and hopefully at the top right now for the original video. You've got a few seconds to go check it out before I move on. Still sticking around? Alright then, let's get started. The first and perhaps most obvious change coming from Subnautica to Below Zero is the new focus on story. While the original had a story, it was largely told through lore and data logs, as well as just the environmental storytelling, which is all still here in Below Zero, but much like Metroid Prime 3 in relation to the earlier two titles in that trilogy, it's taken a more direct storytelling approach. Fully voiced protagonist, a bit more reliance on waypoints to drive you forward rather than natural curiosity. It's not a bad decision, and I think it was executed reasonably well. In the broad strokes, the story revolves around two major plot points: uncovering the mystery behind your sister's death, and assisting an architect alien in finding its way home. I would have omitted this bit about the architect, but it's early in the game, and it's been in the early access version for 2 years now. The architect plotline is probably the most compelling of the two. I won't go into why just yet, but it's a nice continuation of some of what you learned in the original game. The sister plotline, however, falls very flat. It certainly has its moments, but it doesn't really have a strong hook and finish like the architect storyline. In fact, I think you can even beat the game without seeing the starting plotline through to the end. It's really hard to pin down exactly why that plotline doesn't work well. Perhaps it's because it's so hands-off compared to the architect that you actively converse with. The sister plotline relies largely on data logs for engagement, and it's entirely possible to convey a personal story in that way. And it does have its moments, but because it's so spread out across the world, it had to be written in such a way that you could get the full picture from one or two logs, meaning it doesn't really carry much narrative weight. In the early access version, the story was very different in a way I thought was much better. Both the architect plotline and sister plotline were actively involved and even played into each other to an extent. Even from the incomplete version from the early access, it felt like there was a much better through line for the plot involving the sister, playing a slightly more antagonistic role. I'm sure the direction they took with the final release could have been more interesting, and I can't say for sure what internal development decisions resulted in that storyline becoming so disjointed, but I do wish it was given a bit more time to be fleshed out. Or hell, more fucking involved, given you can literally skip it. I know I said that already, but it honestly bothers me enough that I think it deserves reiteration. Now, this next change is less of an issue. The architect, Alan, has been changed from a slightly antagonistic character at the beginning that gradually learns to like the protagonist to not disliking her from the get-go and gradually learning to like her. This was a lateral move at best, but once again, I think the original iteration was slightly more interesting. I think the most egregious change for me was the opening. Once again. Originally, the story began with you already working on the planet, which made for a noticeable shift from the original where you crash land on the planet. It gave suitable time to explore a safe environment and familiarize yourself with your surroundings, and immediately established the architect presence as a major part of the narrative. And you know what they replaced this refreshing opening with? Crashing into the fucking planet! Oh, Christ. Right, so if you can't tell, I really don't like the changes to the main narrative in the final release. It's not a deal breaker, it's still good, and I stuck with it through to the end. The ending itself was perfect, but as someone who experienced the story before, I just can't help but notice how much better it could have been. And in both versions, there's a side character named Marguerite who basically shows up, does nothing that's noteworthy, that contributes to the narrative and then never shows up again. She was originally going to be more involved in the ending from what I could tell, but once again they dropped that. I actually have more I want to talk about on the story, but I'll save it until the end, because it does involve some fairly major spoilers. Don't worry, I'll warn you beforehand. For now, let's talk about something more pleasant. Subnautica, once again, manages to land the design of its alien environments. The world in 4546B's Sector 0 is richly detailed with distinct biomes and the creatures therein. If pressed to complain about anything, the lack of a distinct major landmark can make navigating without beacons slightly more annoying. This is especially true with the new land segments, which look great, but are so muddled that it's obscenely easy to get lost, and I honestly just found exploring those segments incredibly tedious. The act of travel on land itself is interesting, but the level design just doesn't support it. The surface also lacks in creature variety. There's snowstalkers, penguins, and that's about it for anything that isn't a leviathan. The ice worm leviathan is more annoying than scary, considering it can knock you off your snowfalk seemingly on a whim, regardless of how close or far away you are from it. It wasn't fun to deal with, nor was it challenging, which is a shame since the creature itself is pretty nifty. Though the surface isn't the only place with problems. In general, I think the game has a bit of a lighting issue. Well, that's probably not the best phrasing. Lighting for the environments looks amazing, but the problem lies in the dark, or the lack thereof. For whatever reason, the deeper depths of 4546B in this game are fairly evenly lit, almost universally, to the point where I didn't even find myself needing to use headlights half the time. I honestly had a harder time seeing at the surface, and the shallows, at night, than I ever did at the bottom of the world with no lights. It's not a game ruiner, and I don't think a ton of people would notice, probably. I found it incredibly distracting once I took notice, though, if you couldn't tell. That being said, overall performance is much better than the original Subnautica, not involving nearly as much texture pop-in, and the game doesn't experience much slowdown even while having the scanner chip active, which, if you'll recall from my previous video, was one of my noted downsides of the otherwise awesome scanner room. Also, I don't usually go into soundtracks in games much, but I couldn't help but feel the soundtrack of Below Zero was just a bit lacking. While I wouldn't say that the original Subnautica had tracks that ever got stuck in my head, it always had this sinister undertone that crept into its environments and kept you on your toes. The weight is now almost entirely carried by the rest of the sound design, which is handled as well as the original, but the background music itself just feels completely invisible, save for jukebox music. That's odd. I usually save visuals and sound design for last if I bring them up at all. Oh well, let's move on to gameplay changes. In the broad strokes, the game plays almost identically to original Subnautica, save for some minor GUI changes, all of which are nice quality of life improvements. For example, the addition of battery meters next to equipment instead of reading just a number, allowing for easy tracking of power for items that aren't actively in use. And the nested menus in crafting have been changed to no longer require scrolling, now instead relying on a grid, which might not sound like much of an improvement, but the nested menus from the original was a big pet peeve of mine. Otherwise, the changes to the gameplay are more or less the same as noted back in my original critiques coverage of the early access version. The sea moth and cyclops are gone, instead replaced entirely by the sea truck. I miss the Cyclops, needless to say, but I think the Sea Truck is mostly a net positive. It's basically just a modular Sea Moth mobile base. If I had anything to complain about, it's that it's a bit too energy efficient, to the point where, despite having several backup power cells in case of emergency, I basically never dropped below 50% power on the Sea Truck. This might be a weird complaint, but I found it made the overall experience rather toothless compared to the original. One of the highlights of Subnautica for me was having to scramble together an emergency base in the deep ocean caverns to keep my Cyclops from dying from energy depletion. It was stressful but exciting, and made for a very memorable experience. It feels like the amount of pre-planning required for expeditions has gone down significantly, and improvision isn't nearly as viable because of the way materials are distributed now, or because the crafting formula changes. It's not inherently bad. Not everyone wants stressful experiences from a game, let alone in a game that can easily prey on one sphere of the ocean, but I just wish it was a bit more like the original in that respect by default. Though I suppose having too much power efficiency is better than the problem I had with the early access version where the sea truck's power would deplete far too quickly. Additionally, the prawn suit really doesn't do much in this game. Its role as the vehicle for the deepest depths is lost. I mentioned this game was more toothless than the original, right? Yeah, of course I did. The maximum depth you can travel with the sea truck is 1,000 meters, and the maximum depth for the prawn suit is 1,100 meters. 100 meters is practically nothing. You can easily swim that, and I never encountered a depth in the game that would even require anything more than 1,000. This basically limited the prawn suit to only being necessary for large mining nodes, or if you just wanted to goof around with the grappling hook. I mean, sure, it's still somewhat empowering, but it's just lacking in purpose. It's like if you got the Varia suit upgrade in Metroid Prime, and then discovered there weren't any environments that took advantage of the temperature-resisting properties. I mean, sure, taking slightly less damage is nice, but I can achieve the same effect with a fucking sea truck, and its defenses against Leviathans are better than the prawn suit. It kind of removes the real feeling of progression the first game had. Subnautica was very much a Metroidvania with how it staggered out upgrades and vehicles, but the sea truck is so universally useful in practically every scenario that the game just kinda hits a plateau after you get it. It no longer feels like you're gradually growing as a result of your exploration, only that you're clearing the story objectives. And honestly, that's a big letdown, but at least the world is still interesting enough to explore. And before I forget, the Snow Fox is this game's only land vehicle. It's fine. It's not quite as prone to self-destructing as the early access version. It's solid, but not extraordinary. The only thing I find odd is that riding it prevents the negative effects of extreme cold on the surface. I guess the idea is that the radiation from the vehicle is keeping you warm, but to me it just seemed like more of an oversight, presumably resulting from the other vehicles effectively neutralizing any oxygen and cold effects as well. It's not bad, just a weird quirk I noticed. Right, spoiler time. Skip to this time if you don't want to hear any of it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's talk about one last gripe I have with the plot, particularly involving the architect trapped in your head. As a major plot point, you help him regain his corporeal form, after which, if you go to a metaphorical event flag that would have triggered interactions with him, they still play out as if he's still in your head. I suppose you could say he's just speaking telepathically or something, but the game never expresses that's something they're capable of, at least not clearly. This is just a nitpick more than anything, but I felt it should be brought up still. I really like Subnautica Below Zero, but I don't think I love it. It's not the lightning in the bottle experience like the original, and I'd recommend playing the original first anytime, except maybe to those that want to play a version that doesn't prey on thalassophobia as much. Subnautica Below Zero is a lovingly made game that lets you revisit 4546B and see it in a new light, but it's sadly muddled in its vision. The entire experience feels far less coherent than the original, which is quite the odd statement considering how much more story-focused this game is compared to it. Anyone that likes the original will definitely still have a great time with it, and I still think Unknown Worlds is a great developer. I just hope that whatever their next game is, their vision comes across a bit more clearly. God, I hope they don't take this review as much of an insult. If you're listening, I love your work, even if I grilled the game pretty hard, and I still plan to follow your future endeavors. Seriously, if you haven't played Subnautica, go out and do it, especially if you like Metroid Prime or like the idea of exploring alien planets. I can't recommend this series enough. I know I haven't put out a video in over a year now, so thanks for your patience. Went through a rough patch, lost my creative drive, had to go on a business trip for several months that kept me away from nearly all of my equipment, but I think I'm finally out of the rut for now. So, thanks for sticking with me. I really hope you all enjoyed this critique and that this video lit a fire under you.